talked about, oh, recorded? Yeah, we started with a bit of history, and I would be remiss if we didn't talk about a couple of people historically that contributed, not only for me, but I think globally. So one person, because at the time, and we did have a little bit of a conversation about the 80s. At the time, 1977, 1979 was huge in terms of bodybuilding. And the reality is there was not a lot of S&C at the time. It was pretty focused on bodybuilding at that time in terms of the popular media, and really because I don't know if anybody's seen Arnold Schwarzenegger's movie Pumping Iron. I'm sure most of you have, in '77, but that really sort of made it mainstream. It started to make it a little bit more mainstream, and they actually had an art gallery show in New York that was entirely based on just bodybuilders, and they were the sculptures that people were viewing, and people paid big bucks to go and see that. And then in 1979, a guy by the name of Franco Colombo, Chris or Sam, are you able to enable my screen share?
Sam, you got that?
You should be good now, Sheldon.
Thank you. So everybody see this? Okay, give me a thumbs up. Yeah. Okay, so again, Pumping Iron, if you haven't seen it, I recommend you watch it. It's a phenomenal movie about Arnold Schwarzenegger and how focused and diligent he was in terms of his craft. But then that book on the right, this was my very first strength training book. It came out in 1979. I bought it in '81, and this is my actual copy. The pages are falling out of the book. This was my first program, my first exposure to doing any type of strength training. I bought the same weights that Chris Dalcin and Ian were talking about last week, those gray vinyl sand-filled weights, and that was my first sort of foray into strength training. The reality was that Franco Colombo was Arnold Schwarzenegger's mentor. And say what you will about the book itself, again, for me, where there was really no understanding or exposure in terms of how to structure or design a program or what exercises to do, I was all over this. And yes, as a kid in high school, I absolutely pinned myself on the bench trying to do bench press. And thankfully, I wasn't strong enough to tie the collar, so I had to do the unload to get myself out of it. And again, that was my first foray into strength and conditioning. But we were talking about mentors, and I would absolutely be remiss if I do not mention this guy. I don't know if anybody you know him or heard of him, named Buster Oliphant. My very first strength and conditioning workout in a gym was 1982 at this guy's facility. And the facility looked like that. The facility actually was founded over 100 years ago, around 1913, 1914. It just obviously celebrated its 100th birthday in the 2000s. But the gym looked exactly the same in the 80s, in 82, 83 when I was working out there. And it looked the same probably into the 2000s. And the reality is it was stinky, it was dingy, it was a dungeon. Rats were moving out to try and find better accommodations. But I absolutely loved this place. And Buster, who was in his late 60s when I met him, was the only person in the facility who would actually spot people on the bench. So he was the first spot I ever had doing a bench press. And I mean, I had to take a bus, a train, and a streetcar to get there. And I'd go there 2 or 3 days a week. And I absolutely loved it. But this guy was spotting everybody. And they had a lot of NFL players in the summer that were working out there, a lot of CFL players that were working out there. So just in terms of the history of Toronto and actually looking at facilities, again, I wanted to make sure that I mentioned this guy. He's part of the founders of facilities and also strength training in Toronto, dating back because his dad was the one who actually founded the facility over 100 years ago. And him, in terms of a mentor for me, led me to my first job in actually managing a fitness facility in the late 80s, which again came out by accident. But I looked to him in terms of what he was doing, how he was running it, and just the fact that the place was falling apart, but everybody loved to be there. And it was a real good lesson for me in terms of trying to create a culture around an environment. So again, thanks Chris and Sam for letting me start off, but I definitely wanted to mention Buster because Buster's gym for me was absolutely pivotal. Thanks guys.
Amazing, Sheldon. So the theme came up with all the panel last week on, in the 80s, it was pretty much bodybuilding for the most part. So let me ask you guys a question. Is there still a place for bodybuilding in modern S&C? And if so, does it look the same as it did then, or is it different?
Crickets, so I'll dive in there. Hey, absolutely, there's a place for some of the techniques used in modern bodybuilding. Obviously, there's many sports where you need to put on mass. A lot of the techniques we use evolved from bodybuilding S techniques, and bodybuilding S techniques evolved from powerlifting and Olympic weightlifting for the most part. A lot of you may not know, but the original Mr. Universe contests in the 1950s and 60s were a combination of form and function. So you'd compete and lift the most weight, and then at the end there'd be a pose down. And so it was a combination of posing and lifting that gave you the Mr. Universe title. So there's obviously crossovers between them when it comes to performance. You take someone who's very strong, won't automatically make them the best athlete, but it sure opens up doors for them to be more athletic. Even take a man as full as Jordan Foley, who's here, who is known to move heavy weights, and you put him in an Olympic weightlifting scenario for the first time, and all of a sudden he can throw up weights more so than any other person that I've trained for months and months or years and years at a time. So that base strength can be transferable to a lot of different things if you apply it properly. Just doesn't mean that it's the only way. But if you look around the league in the NFL, you can say for better or for worse, but there's many very top level NFL players who do largely bodybuilding type workouts. I watched Brian Cushing, linebacker for Texans, when I was in Texas. He did basically bodybuilding workouts. Ray Lewis, bodybuilding workouts. That's basically it. If you're watching, what is it, The Last Dance, now that's a little bit old school, but kind of split routine type workouts they were doing. So there is a place for it. Now, is it the best way? No. Is there other things you should be doing on top of it? Absolutely. But absolutely, there's a place for that kind of stuff. That's my opinion.
I would add to that too. I think, working with the football team at McMaster for 9-10 years, and even football at York prior to that, any athlete I've really worked with, there's obviously a need for, increased lean mass and for me, just building through hypertrophy and bodybuilding techniques. Some of the athletes actually enjoy some of the overload principles that we would use there. Enjoy the rest pause training, enjoy the eccentric overloads at the end. I mean, I've been to numerous training workshops at University of Michigan, Michigan State, you name it. And a lot of the stuff that they do with their athletes just to engage the athletes. I mean, you got to remember, you've got to leave an impact on the athlete at the end of your sessions. And sometimes it's as easy as doing even a body weight set to failure, and then all of a sudden throwing overload on top of them with resisted, eccentrics, stuff like that, where a partner is adding load to them externally. That leaves a lasting impression on an athlete. So I think there are times where we use that in our tool belt. Certainly it's not the only way, but I think used concurrently while training speed, while training speed and power, I think doesn't hurt to develop the overall athlete.
Yeah, for me, Trevor mentioned something that's key, and it's a distinction between form and function. And most of the athletes that we work with are going to be along that spectrum. And I think it depends upon the athletes that you're working with. For me, in the early 90s, and working with a lot of national team and Olympic figure skaters, again, they do have to be considering both form and function because it's part of their scoring system.
I'll come at it strictly from a vanity standpoint. Working with guys, hockey players, and the better part of the 80s was our lifeblood. Guys just want to look good. They want to, thinking that, being a little bit more stacked or a little bit more muscle never hurt their confidence. One guy is a coach in the OHL right now. After we did what we expected him to do from a standpoint of sport performance, always ended off by doing more kind of bodybuilding techniques just to add on a little bit size. he was known as a bit of a fighter, drafted by the Leafs, but it never hurt. Never understand what drives a lot of, I'll say, guys to the gym. Is a lot of the time it's vanity. It's trying to impress girls for the most part. Do you guys remember that research that came out? It's got to be late 80s, early 90s, when they looked at 3,000, 4,000 athletes in NCAA programs and what drove them towards, of all things, using anabolic agents to help them. Only 30% of them were athletes, really. Most of them were just trying to, again, look bigger, look better, and impress people. So it has a psychological edge, a vanity edge to it. But you do everything you can to try to, there are a lot of sports that are weight sensitive. We got to understand that too. And you, Sheldon, you talked about figure skating. There's a point where, the ability to jump, to pull off a triple axel, every bit of mass that you try to carry into that jump is going to fight against you from fulfilling the triple spin. So sometimes you have to bring science back into it to, just to, say, look, you don't need the extra mass. So I worked in boxing and in a little bit of wrestling, and we try to make sure if they were 55 and under, we were at 54.9, and you had to tell them that increased muscle mass was going to put them up in a weight class and bring them into a whole different kind of type of wrestling or boxing. So.
Can I just add to that? Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Speaking of some of the old books, so this is old school screen sharing. I don't know if you can see that title. Bill Pearl. Yeah,
legend.
Keys to the Inner Universe. Like, look at the spine on this thing. So many exercises were, brought to our attention when the bodybuilding group came in. You got machines, you start doing your thing, you got Nautilus, but this kind of opened my eyes in terms of the different lifts that were available, right, to kind of get to your goal for your development. But when Chris mentioned also drug use, you remember Mario Di Pasquale?
Oh, yeah.
Remember that name?
The anabolic, yeah. He came up with the anabolic diet.
I'm sitting on my shelf. I'm thinking, like, geez, that's the kind of thing that just opened the eyes as to, first of all, what everybody else was doing. And I guess a lot of supplement use started to come out of the bodybuilding end. Bodybuilders usually knew what drugs and anything else beforehand. And that just opened my eyes in terms of, like, what am I dealing with here and how can I compete against it? So it's funny you guys say that, but yeah, interesting times.
Way before the low carb, high fat diets were around, this guy was promoting high protein. It was called the anabolic diet. He was an MD PhD. He was no dummy. He was 55 going 60 with a 28-inch waist and 48 chest. Yeah, this guy was unbelievable. To the point that even Ira Jacobs brought him into a CSEP conference just to talk because he was so controversial to nutritionists. This guy was brilliant. Yeah, he was a real trendsetter.
So Ian, I'm curious, what's your thoughts on hypertrophy and sprinting and speed? We look back at the 80s and those guys were monsters. And nowadays there's a camp that says mass is bad on sprinters. What's your thoughts on that coming from the bodybuilding world?
Yeah, that's been a tough one because I think it depends on the individual themselves, because some individuals can just gain mass from strength, and some you have to literally go back to hypertrophy to gain some weight on them. So yeah, I come from, having run with Ben and all those guys and seeing them, you're like, what the heck? Like, I couldn't believe the size of these guys. There was one girl that went to my school and she was a national athlete. She was massive. And we're like, what's going on here? But yeah, I think it really depends because, what's his name? Can't remember the individual I saw speak, and we had a conversation. He was on I'm going to get you as light as possible. And I was kind of on the whatever happens, right? We'll get the individual faster, but I think I've seen the, purposely dropping somebody's weight and not being good for them because they're not really strong anymore. They can't really absorb the forces that they're pushing on. So it's a tough one, man. I mean, obviously there's too much mass. You're not gonna have a 300-pound sprinter, but I think a lot of the injuries now are coming from the, I guess, non-ability of the tissue to take the forces that they're dealing with. So I don't know. It's a good question. It's going to be going on for years.
Trev, do you want to touch on the point you just typed there?
Yeah, it's from a steroid user's perspective, we've known this for years. I grew up surrounded by steroid users, not being one myself, but always being fascinated by those who did it. And, common practice is to get as heavy as you can to lift as much as you can. Anybody who's been really involved in strength sports or followed anything like the strongmen, the advantage that weight gain gives you. I know personally, I moved up from 85 pounds to 240 pounds in a 2.5-year period. And I recognize the strength gains that go with it. What the beauty of that is that when you get to those higher body weights where you're training at higher loads, even when you do your weight cut, a lot of that strength is still there, that neural drive, that capacity to train at a higher level, whether you want to call it dad strength or whatever it may be. And that's one of the great advantages of using steroids, even as young athletes who are not tested. It's very common for young athletes to use steroids for prolonged periods of time and then come off when they go into tested federations. And then those strength transfers carry through, even though they've lost some of that lean body mass.
So it seems like the consensus in general is yes, there's a place for hypertrophy and knowing when and where to use it. How do you guys feel about machines? Because a lot of you brought up most of the gyms were full of machines, and there's also a camp these days that's absolutely against them. So anyone have thoughts either way?
Probably in a general phase of conditioning, I would say it's got its place. You can load, it's safe. Again, I grew up in the advent of the universal machine. It had a bench press, it had a place to do lat pull downs. And were they sport specific? Unless you're doing lat pull downs and bench press, no, but as we got more and more knowledge again through the Tudor era and through Burko-Sansky and understanding, trying to get more to what I call the 5 pillars, understanding what really enhances sport. You try to get away from general kind of conditioning, which I would say in the early days was, yeah, go ahead, do machines to try to get heavy and then try to get closer and closer to specific kind of conditioning. So never had any qualms with it. And a lot of the days too, you're prescribing exercise and not necessarily, I'm going to talk in the days of when I was at the Fitness Institute, you're prescribing exercise that you're not necessarily supervising. So machines, and I'll talk again to the universal, and was a place that a person, a novice, 60, we only allowed 18-year-old kids in our place, but was a place for them to load up without the fear of a bar coming crashing down on their chest. That's my take.
I try not to think in terms of extremes. For example, nobody should be using machines or everybody should be using free weights. The reality is with athletes traveling all over the world, I can never be sure in some cases until the athletes get there and send me a picture of the gym, what they're going to have access to. Mm-hmm. So being able to teach them what they can do in different types of environments is key.
And machines are tools in your toolbox, right? As an Olympic weightlifter, someone who's quite involved in that area, I've worked with many coaches who tell me machines are a complete waste of time. Even I've had a very good coach and mentor tell me that trap bars are a waste of time. and just do pulls and do deadlifts, which if you've ever tried to teach a pull versus trap bar, it takes quite a bit more time doing a pull than a trap bar properly. But until you've had an injury and tried to train with free weights, you may not ever appreciate the role of machines. So don't forget those people who are trying to do rehabilitation. I remember when I had my first ACL reconstruction, going to the weight room and trying to roll a dumbbell across the room to the bench using my crutches, and trying to get on the bench and trying to pick up that dumbbell and then roll it back and get it in the rack, right? So there's lots of situations where you can use machines and get a lot of power. And don't forget, some of the machines that are out there are phenomenal. You know, some of the hammer strength, the Kaiser Power series, we use a ton. Cables, there's things you can do with cables explosively that you just can't do with a lot of other free weight type equipment. Doesn't mean you absolutely need them, but great little tools in your toolbox. It makes it interesting too.
Yeah, I was going to speak to the rehab and reconditioning aspect of things as well, Trev. Like I mean, you know, we're currently working through all the reconditioning programs that we offer through our university right now. And in the early phases, I mean, other than isometrics, you know, we do have to go to some type of isometric hold on a hamstring curl or adductor, abductor. It's amazing what you have to do in early stages of an MCL, LCL. So yeah, I think you can't overlook that. And like Trev said, to echo that, I mean, you know, when I first got hired at McMaster, one of the key pieces they had in the weight room in the corner was a hammer strength jammer machine, and for the football program. And there are angles that you can train at that are tough to replicate. And that machine alone certainly, you know, you can do isolation on one side, you can do bilateral extension with drive. I mean, our linemen, once we took that out of the weight room due to lack of space, were extremely upset that it was gone. So, you know, we try to replicate it with a landmine with handles, but still to this day, I think that one's tough to beat if you have space. So they're all a tool in the toolbox. I agree.
Love it, guys. So let's go the other way. You know, you guys just brought up tools in the toolbox. What for you is the most timeless tools that have stood the test of time since you've started?
I'll go on this one. Heart rate monitors from a standpoint of conditioning. Nobody's really improved on, you know, back in the day, like I told you, I hate to talk about this, but when I started in '84 at the Fitness Institute, we were doing 12 lead ECGs on athletes and then teaching them to monitor doing either their carotid pulse or a radial pulse. But when the advent of heart rate monitors came out, that was, and nobody's going to do polar, they're still ahead of the game. That for me, from a conditioning side, and it's turned into a great monitoring tool. It's turned into being like I even, you know, working with Gavin Smelly, I still put a heart rate monitor on him just to show myself and anybody's interested, and especially him, the caloric demand that, you know, warm up, cool down, and maybe 6 sprints in a workout, how much metabolic cost there is just from a standpoint of excessive post-oxygen consumption demand from training. And right away it gives me a tool to say, let's look at your caloric balance. So I think that's, you know, next to probably just free weight, that would be the technology that stood the test of time for me.
That's a simple one. To this day, my mom still uses the very first weight set I ever bought. It stood the test of time. She still uses it 3 days a week.
I have a unique one, self-massage. So, and 15 years ago, the foam roller came along, and I was at the NSA conference, and there's a bunch of people that you would know there rolling around and doing presentations on the foam roller. And, you know, the foam rollers are ubiquitous. And I was just laughing. I was going, just use a plate, guys, or use a stick. Or we've been doing self-massage before our workouts forever. It's crazy how long that has lasted. And now, of course, we've got 15 different ways we can do that self-massage. So that's a fun one, I thought. That's a little different. But the other one is high-intensity interval training. When back in the 90s, that's the kind of conditioning we did with our athletes. We didn't run them 3 miles a day. And we used to get criticized for that. And I had a professor tell me, why do you call it strength conditioning? You guys don't really do any conditioning. And I said, well, yeah, we do these repeated sprints. Well, that's not conditioning. Well, you know, it took until 2009, 2010 for that actually to be okay to do. And people in the research agreeing that interval training will actually give you not just aerobic benefits, but health benefits and performance benefits all at the same time. So it's good to see that stuck around and actually grown in popularity finally.
So
I can chime in if you want. Sleds. I mean, coming back when I was a kid playing football, just at first we started hitting humans that were standing on sleds and pushing them around. But I think for me, using sleds to train in multiple dimensions. I mean, you can talk about sleds, you can talk about bands, but just adding external load in various directions and with various vectors, I think just for me helps train athletes in multiple directions and with, allows them to generate force or resist force in ways that sometimes we can't replicate, like on deceleration with a partner pulling them, for example, and doing eccentric loading. Just by being dragged down a turf strip, I think helps quite a bit. So sleds and bands for me are things that have stood the test of time that I use quite a bit with athletes.
Nice, Trev. I'll come back to what you wrote there, barbell. I thought that's what you would have gone to first. I've only been doing this 15 years now, and Olympic lifts, power lifts, and derivatives of such are almost in everyone's toolbox in some way, shape, or form. So it's one thing I've seen. Ian, what do you got on this one?
Yeah, all of the above. I can't think anything else because I think we're kind of going back to that situation with, being locked up. You can't get barbells, you can't get weights, you can't get any sort of implement. So I got to say it's, the barbell and equipment itself, longevity.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to touch on that one just because there's so much out there and so much distraction and noise.
And if I could I add to that, Chris?
Yeah.
Again, historically, we just don't understand how strong people were. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, I would say in general, more people are strong, but some of the strongest people today were obviously stronger than the people back then. But if you look at the strength of these individuals back in the 80s who just had a barbell, that's all they had. It blows away what you'll see at the collegiate system now in most situations. And you throw in there a little bit of that farmer strength that came along with it, that manual labor strength that came with it. These guys were phenomenally strong, powerful, dangerous individuals. And honestly, I think a lot of our athletes haven't got much past that, even though they've been training for years and years under our supervision, because they haven't evolved that strength over a long period of time like some of the athletes did back then.
Yeah, so on that one, I don't know if anyone's seen it. Hopefully it's still on there. There was a Netflix documentary called Legends of Strength, and it actually goes back from the very first strength competitions on record. And it's actually a historical 10-part series. It's super awesome for anyone to go way, way, way back to like the circus days and bending stuff and all that. So check it out, Legends of Strength on Netflix.
Legends of Strength?
Yeah. Buried deep in there. It's a good one. I see there was a question for Ian. Anything specific to sprint training stood the test of time? Ian, you want to touch on that aside from what you wrote?
I said stopwatch, but any sort of timing gates or like, especially now, and you can kind of watch and be hands off and get a time. And when Chris used to use the Opti, it was phenomenal seeing the data would come out of that. Something that you can't necessarily, duplicate yourself. I've used a 1080 sprint once, and I'm like, oh my gosh, wish I could get it. But it's just amazing in terms of you got to be able to quantify what's going on between the last session they were there, this session they were there, and see if there's any improvement or what's going on. So just a basic stopwatch in your hand or some sort of timing system. It's stable. For sure. Awesome.
So let's go back to where we finished the last one. I wonder if anyone had any other thoughts on the gimmicks and funny stuff. One came to my mind. I have horrible hops, and I got bought into the jump soles. Jimmy can jump, and I used to walk around on those and do all the training with the VHS, and yeah, didn't help me one bit. But what else you guys got from the gimmicks?
You got this, Chris? You going first, or
I'm thinking. Go ahead.
I got a bunch. I got a whole laundry list here. But related to that, what's interesting is the pendulum swing of things, right? So some of you may have seen my lecture on evidence-based practice, but vibration. Vibration was used for fat loss when you had those belts around your waist shaking you like crazy in the 70s and early 80s, and then it went away, and then it came back. Vibration plates, NSA conference of 2008. Vibration was everywhere. The Student Research Award went to a study on vibration. Kaiser was building in vibration plates into their power cage racks, and boom, and then it went away again. Right, so that's an interesting one. But the other one I'll put out there that may be a little bit of controversial is barefoot training. That would be one, because
Chappie, you were big on that, weren't you?
Yeah, like everybody was barefoot running for a while there, burning their shoes, that kind of thing. And there's lots of evidence that barefoot, and similar with vibration, there's lots of evidence for the use of vibration in training. There's lots of evidence for some uses of barefoot, but most people couldn't do it. And then not to mention the long list of supplements. Don't even get me started on supplements. Every 10 years, carnitine seems to come back, and inositol and things like that keep popping back in. Another one, static stretching. Static stretching went away real all of a sudden. Everybody used to run around the gym and then static stretch, and now everybody's doing crazy world's greatest stretches and that kind of thing. So you've seen a lot of things come and go, that's for sure.
Wasn't that many Olympics ago, Trev, that I'm trying to remember her name. She ran the 800 meter. No, maybe a little longer, 5,000 meter.
Bud?
Bare feet.
Zola Bud.
Yeah, yeah. And just to watch it. And she got spiked one year, didn't she? Was that in the Olympics?
She did, but when she got spiked, she was actually wearing shoes. If you want to look at barefoot running, look at a Bibi Aquila. Because he was a gold medalist without shoes, 68, but then wore shoes the next Olympics and didn't do as well. But actually he did win as well. Without shoes, 1 year he won, and then with shoes he won the Olympic gold medal. But the thing, Trevor, the thing about barefoot running, and we have Born to Run to blame for that. The reality is, it's not that people didn't know how to do it; it's people didn't do it properly. You can't go a lifetime wearing shoes and then in 180 degrees start doing all of your training without shoes. It was just ridiculous in terms of the method that people started doing it. In terms of other machines, I will show you these two guys. So the PT4000 in the 80s was all the rage. Okay, not only was the PT4000 all the rage in the 80s, so were this Nordic track. So we talked about the Nordic track last week, and what I will say about the Nordic track is it's actually a really good machine. The challenge is that people in the fitness clubs just found it too difficult and were not able to actually use it properly. So that's the main reason why it died. And then Sam, I put this in here for you because we did talk about it last week. Nautilus training and machines, and again, those were huge in the 80s and into the 90s before they started to die off.
So let's segue. We've talked a lot about the 80s. Let's touch on the 90s a bit. What comes to your mind when I say the 90s and strength training? What were the trends? What changed? What did you guys gravitate towards? Who did you look to at the time?
Well, I'll answer your first question, Chris. In the 90s, it went from 10-minute abs to 9-minute abs to 8-minute abs to 6-minute abs. Just in terms of, and I don't know if people were buying microwaves more frequently during the 90s, and that's the reason why it kept on going down that way, but that was huge in the 90s.
Probably clubs were springing up a lot more. back in the day, you talked about Nautilus came on, was a big industry that blew through Toronto. There was more places back in, again, my youth. Probably Vic Tanny's was probably the only place you could call a gym. There was the boxing clubs and the weightlifting clubs, but they were down on Danforth, away from where I grew up in Thornhill. But
better bodies.
These had a little bit, but not strength training. YMCA was more about cardio and health and had a different. But in the 90s, I'd like to think things started to really start to sprout out, and universities were starting to get a bit more committed to enhancing their conditioning facilities. Ours was really, U of T was kind of crude. And we, as a varsity athlete, we used to have to share it with, obviously, general population. I think they may still have that problem now with their big facility on Devonshire and the Gold Ring. But I just think fitness was just becoming a craze. Jane Fonda was selling her videos and life was good. Everybody's joining and clubs everywhere.
To add to that, some of the bigger, additions were spin classes. Became all the rage in the 90s, even step classes, things like that. I just remember through, private fitness, but yeah, spin for sure. That has stood the test of time and is still in our facilities to this day, or, it was pretty big. So that was large, and I would agree. I mean, I do remember, 90s, going to university, going obviously to college as well, and the fitness facilities were still behind the times. I can still remember the York Track and Field Center, walking into the caged area at the very far back before they blew it out and built the entire biosteel facility that they have there now. But I remember it was crude is the right word. There wasn't a lot. I just remember all the Nautilus pieces along the outside of the track. The slant boards for doing incline base abdominals or hip raises, things like that. I just remember all those pieces that still the athletes use quite a bit, multi-station machines and things like that. But and then the free weights in the back with the old metallic dumbbells and barbells, squat racks, things like that. We use a ton in the early 2000s, but knowing they had been there all through the 90s for sure.
For myself, my business partner in our company, what was huge in the 90s as well is that's when companies actually started to invest in building in-house fitness facilities and gyms. So that became a staple of our business, is actually being able to provide programming and structured programming within actually companies and corporations.
And if in my opinion, the biggest shift from the 80s to 90s, there's two things that really changed our strength conditioning industry. One was Stu McGill's low back disorders book and the concept of core stability. It completely changed how we viewed what goes on in that abdominal region and how our approach to training. I remember being approached in 1998 to write an article for a fitness magazine and about core stability. And I was looking at it going, I'm not sure I really understand what the hell it is. Wrote an article anyway, but I think I kind of faked it. But yeah, and now we talk about it like, it's pretty common sense. It's everyday knowledge. So that was a big shift. And then I mentioned already the warm-up and our approach to the warm-up and things like potentiation and dynamic versus static stretching has changed quite a bit. Even when I was at the university level back in the early 90s, it was still static stretching, PNF, facilitated stretching, dominant warm-ups. And now obviously that's flipped right away, and there's been umpteen thousands of articles now published on different warm-up approaches for affecting performance. So those were big changes in our industry that I think has changed our approach overall. And then as we get into the 2000s, then there's even bigger changes, but I'll wait and see if we talk about that later.
Yeah, so before we get into 2000s, I'm going to shift gears a bit now, and we're going to do a big picture general question. We are all humans, and this isn't the easiest industry. So I'm curious, what has been the biggest sacrifices you guys have made personally to get where you are, if you're willing to share that?
One of my early mentors was Scott Livingston. He was trying to get me to possibly, one day take over with the Habs because I'm from Montreal. I'm bilingual. He had numerous meetings with me trying to get me to, take over the AHL team in Hamilton. And then, when it was his time to retire, it would be a great fit for me, obviously, from, moving back home, I guess, more than anything. But just pro sport wasn't for me. It wasn't an interest of mine. Collegiate sport is where I saw the biggest potential for me to enjoy my time in my employment. I liked stability. I didn't like the uncertainty of being with a club one year and not the next. It just, pro sport wasn't for me, and it wasn't. I'm a big family guy, so not being able to being on the road 6 to 8 months of the year wasn't for me either. So I think that was a big one. The second one was having to decline a few Olympic Winter Games with Hockey Canada due to the birth of my children. Was another one that was tough because I couldn't centralize for 6 months knowing my kids would be born around then. And so just real tough decisions, sacrifices that needed to be made in order to make sure the family came first. It was tough for me.
I got some good ones. Beat this. So in high school, I got on my health kick when I was 15. I quit eating all sweets and I quit drinking when I was 15 years old. And then I proceeded to realize in the small town of Exeter, Ontario, I couldn't get the gains I wanted. So I actually moved out of home when I was 17 years old, and I moved to the city and I went on welfare for $300 a month so I could train at Popeye's gym in Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, and start competing in powerlifting. Lived on welfare for $300 a month. Now, there's greater complexity in that. My parents lost their shirts in the business and they had no money either. But anyway, but then I went, got my undergraduate degree, and I realized I want to be a strength conditioning coach. The only way to do that was to go to the US back then. And I quit a full-time job and made my soon-to-be wife quit her full-time job to move to America. And she didn't even have a proper visa where she could work, for a $300 a month stipend as a strength coach at Northern Arizona University, living in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is pretty expensive. It's like Aspen, Colorado type prices. And we had a couple thousand in the bank. That was it. We went down there and my wife worked under the table, and it was awful. Like, we just scraped and scraped and scraped. Anyway, that being said, we got through it, got a PhD out of the whole deal. But then I came back, and now I think a lot of you guys are like me. You don't get paid by the hour. I coach right now, I think 20 to 24 hours a week. And I think I've been doing almost that. When my kids were younger, maybe not so much, but I coach basically for free for 20 plus hours a week. And I've been doing that now for almost 20 years. So it's what you do for fun, right?
Yeah, I agree with you there, Trevor. If we didn't like it, we wouldn't do it, because it's a lot of time, money, and effort, but I enjoy it. I came out of the banking industry and I probably would have been dead right now. I hated it. So I agree with you. It's a love for it, and I wouldn't change it. But yeah, it's a sacrifice in a sense, but at the end of the day, when you see what happens with an individual, it's worth it.
Sheldon, Chris?
For me, was
Go ahead, Chris.
there was a point where the Fitness Institute, which kind of used provincial funding to outfit the labs with metabolic carts, ergometers, treadmills, was not part of their business plan anymore. So I had to basically get my own money and bought my own. I've owned 3 metabolic carts. I've owned numerous treadmills, numerous ergometers, lactate analyzers. I've had 3 until got into the better technology. So the outlay, and when you have to roll this into a business plan, but back in the early days of this, the National Sports Center and them sending athletes out to you of all different, sports, the money wasn't there to basically offset the cost of your equipment. So I personal trained on the side. I did gym. I kept doing gym supervision. I still did a little cardiac rehab because I needed this equipment to really keep the high performance model. These are the most important tools in my toolbox. So was laying that out. And a lot like Steve, for 17 years working with New Jersey Devils, there was 2 or 3 opportunities or conversations where they said, would you want to move to New Jersey? And I felt like in hockey, you may get pigeonholed. You're only doing hockey all the time. And the one thing I've loved about my job since day one is the variety. I've enjoyed every second I've had with the women's hockey team, but I loved working in rhythmic gymnastics, and I loved working in, just finished with swimming and other sports. So variety is the spice of life. And for me, it was an easy decision to say no to New Jersey. And I've had friends been in the business, and there used to be a line that the only reason you take a job in pro sport is to get fired. You're only as good as the management. If a coach comes in and they don't like him anymore, everybody tends to move out. And that was the kind of disincentive to jump into pro sports.
For my business partner and I, we decided early on day one that we did not want to be in pro sport either, that we wanted to focus our energies and our attentions towards amateur sport. But there were challenges, especially when we started our company. And we could have taken some pro contracts, but we decided not to. And Trevor, I was actually making $250 a week, and my business partner had to go on EI. And we had to borrow $15,000 from one of our clients, and we had to match that within a certain period of time in order to get the funding, because we were able to get a government grant that matched that funding. So we were able to do that, and our sacrifice even after that was hiring our first employee, which we couldn't really afford. We decided, both of us, not to take any salaries, but to hire this one superstar who ended up working for us for 19 years. And I think the sacrifices that my business partner have made have been for not only our company, but for each other. And I think, for him as well, leading up to the Sydney Games, he had to move out to Vancouver to finish his level 4 in order to get to be there when Simon won the gold medal. But I mean, the sacrifices, I don't know that I would use the word sacrifice. I mean, it's something that you do because you love what you're doing, and you get done what you need to get done.
It's entrepreneurial. It's a spirit.
I would add too, I think I agree with all of you. I think for the collegiate transition coaches on the line too, I think it's, for me, difficult decisions were also offers to go down to the NCAA schools and work at a few NCAA schools. The salaries were much more lucrative. But I think for me, I would just speak to the pride of the Canadian pride and just wanting to grow. What we've started here in this country at the collegiate level, I think is what kept me here and working at Canadian universities rather than going down to large NCAA schools and working there. I think was a tough decision for me as well, but one that I don't regret for one second, for sure.
Steve-O, I don't know if anyone else can say they've been a head strength coach at 3 universities now, so owning that one. So let's switch to professional. What has been your biggest professional struggle? So taking the personal side out of it over your career.
Can you repeat that one more time, Chaps?
Yeah. So what has been your biggest professional struggle? So something specifically to do with your job. Like a common one I hear these days is the way everything is going sports science and tech. A lot of people have a hard time with it because they're not tech oriented, or vice versa, because we're in a modern tech age. There's people that struggle with the social side of things. So I'm curious what you had to struggle with and overcome the most over your career to get where you're at.
Well, I'll start. Probably education degree. When you start working more with national team athletes, you start conversations more with people that have their master's and PhD. Sheldon talked about working in figure skating. When we used to do contracts for figure skating, you're basically butting heads with Norm Gledhill at York. They were the ones that set down the protocols. You start working in hockey, women's hockey specifically. You got Dr. Smith and Steve Norris, two phenomenally smart people. And you're hitting them with your PhD degree from University of, not PhD, but PhE degree from University of Toronto. But that was probably one of kind of the setbacks professionally. And I think most of that becomes now, it's all become prerequisite to even get into the fields of high performance sport. Starts with education more so than experience.
Yeah, for me initially, and again, my first job managing a facility was in 88, 89. And at the time, the age requirement was 25. I ended up getting the job. I just turned 21. And all of a sudden, I'm thrown in, and only because the guy who was managing actually quit. I was there to be a director of a camp. And lo and behold, within 2 weeks, they're asking me to manage this facility. And I have no clue about how to hire staff, discipline staff, fire. It's the first time I had to file a police report because one of the adults were stealing. I had to manage a budget, and it wasn't on Excel or a spreadsheet. It was this red Duotang folder that the facility owner gave me and said, here, manage this budget. So for me, the biggest challenge, because I'm not really a numbers guy, is looking at budgets and managing budgets. And if I had to do over, I would take actually some business courses related to that.
Biggest challenge for me over the years is people pissing me off. Coaches, yeah, some of you guys too. Coaches, parents tell me how to do my job and tell me they saw something somewhere that we should all do, and they had the best thing, and Joe Blow did a TV show where they did this, and Marcus Allen never lifted a weight in his life, and kids shouldn't lift weights, it stunts your growth. I've been dealing with this stuff for 32 years, and it's gotten a little bit better, but still almost on a daily basis. Just 2 months ago, I got in a debate with my colleagues at a facility where I've been quite involved for some time, telling me how my kid shouldn't squat that deep. He's going to hurt his knees, and he's going to stunt his growth. Oh my God, I almost lost my frickin' mind. Anyway, yeah, so that's one of the biggest challenges. And then the other one is, I think a lot of us can agree, is Sheldon alluded to this, we're not good at getting money. I've never been good at asking to be paid to do what I do. Just, we're all terrible at that. And I put a little post, should we work for free? Because boy, if you add up the hours we put in, that's kind of how it is. And honestly, for me, it kind of pisses me off when strength coaches complain about, well, I worked overtime this week, so I'm going to bank my hours and I'm going to take 3 weeks off. Like, I'm kind of like, yeah, that's kind of what we do though. But at the same time, you're thinking, is that the right thing? Should I change my attitude towards that? So money's always a tough thing.
Well, Trev, that's an interesting one, because I've thought a lot about that working for a private tech company now. And I think the nature of it is that we're givers by trade. Being in a company that has to sell and watching professional sales guys do their job, coaches make bad sales guys because we want to give to the person sitting across from us as opposed to take. And that to me is one of the fundamental qualities that makes us good at our job, but makes us not so good at those business aspects. At least that's what I've come to in my little deducing that.
Chris, let me add to that. So the challenge is that S&C as a profession is maybe 30, 40 years old at best, maybe 50, where, medicine, dentistry, we're talking hundreds of thousands of years old. And coaching, a lot of people do not see coaching and S&C as a profession, because typically it's been something that's been expected for free. typically it's something that mom and dad will volunteer to help do if it's coaching a team or providing some conditioning programming. So again, it's partly societal as well in terms of the expectations, which is why we need professional associations. It's why, you know, we need to be able to support and look at the CSCA, because one of the purposes is to elevate the level of professionalism and expectation of professionalism and understanding in terms of the industry, and not only the industry that people are in, but also in terms of people who are employing us as S&C coaches.
I'd like to add to that. If you look at how much time we spend with athletes, and I could talk for myself, but probably happens at the collegiate level, we're spending more time with the athletes sometimes than the coach. If they're coming to you 4 times a week, especially in the off season, if you add up the hours, you'd be surprised how much time you spend with the athletes. You're having a much bigger impact on them, and I don't want to undermine coaching, but you may get more value out of, they'll pay more for a nutritionist, but you, at the end of the day, you're the front line. Strength and conditioning is playing a big role in the development of the athlete. So my proponent is that's why we should define ourselves as coaches, and try to be on that same level of the hockey coach or the football coach, because and I reach out to Ian on this. You know, there's probably more coaches that do strength and conditioning than strength and conditioning guys that do coaching of a specific sport. It seems still, and I could talk for track and field, there's a lot of mom and pops out there that are giving out exercise prescription, specifically weight training. You should be nowhere close to a squat bar. It's because, again, the way they develop their little system, but we have to elevate our notoriety and be able to look eye to eye to a coach and says, look, I'm a strength coach. If you want development for enhancing the sport that you coach, treat me the same way.
I think, chaps, I would add to the, when you talk about the struggle, I think, I don't know, for me being one of the first collegiate ones, the struggle was finding mentorship at the collegiate level. I had to look south of the border for the most part. Didn't realize that, Scott Livingston was doing at Concordia for years before me. And, within the province, it was difficult. So I had reached out to NCAA schools with very little response. And so that was tough for me. I think the second piece would be compliance, or sorry, more, not compliance, but compassion fatigue for a lot of practitioners. Being able to balance, I don't know, for myself, my first job at York, I had 14 teams I was in charge of doing strength and conditioning for. It was Burnout City. And I took the job just pure out of passion, but didn't really think about what that would look like on a practical basis. But the compassion fatigue that I see in some coaches who just are so, we give by nature, but at the same time, we don't take time for ourselves to create a level of balance and rest and recovery in order to have the energy to do it. So I think that was probably a big struggle for me. And then the last, I think I would agree, is the finance aspect of things. Now in my new role, having to balance numerous budgets that are, quite a bit, just making sure that I have the education to back that up, and at the same time are doing, business courses, things like that, in order to kind of catch up in a realm that isn't innate to a strength and conditioning coach is something that's certainly a struggle for sure.
So Trevor, you just put in a comment, and I know it was tongue in cheek, just in terms of the national governing body, and just for knowledge sake, with the CSCA, I've actually had conversations with the Coaching Association of Canada. And ideally, in my mind, you get to the point where the CSCA, through an S&C certification or programming or accreditation, is actually recognized by the Coaching Association of Canada. So I've started those conversations, but I can tell you it's not a short conversation to have with them. It's something that's going to take months to years, because there's a political quagmire that's in the mess in the middle of all of this.
Let me toss one out related to that. I renewed my CEP yesterday, and I'm now officially a high performance sports specialist for no other reason that I was a CEP and renewed. And that's something that now there's competition against the CSCA on that aspect. What are your thoughts on this?
Was that through CSET?
Yeah. They've created a high performance sports specialization as a branch of a CEP. And there's right now, everyone is grandfathered in. There's no testing, no requirements, no practical experience, nothing.
Because they don't have any testing or anything.
Oh, I got a rant now, man. You just
Give her.
me up. Yeah, so I was at the CSEP conference last year when they announced it. The people who were involved were there. I actually got to chat with them a little bit, and I kind of actually called them out on it, saying, A, you don't have enough people involved in managing the CSEP to actually create this and do it properly. You don't have that skill set. You don't have the people. You don't have the mentorship. And B, you're cutting the grass of everybody who's working in the profession right now doing this job by saying, we're the gold standard organization for fitness certification. And now we are also, by proxy, a gold standard of certification for people who work as human performance coaches. And that is just so disrespectful to every single person who's on this call right now. It's so low. And the fact that they didn't consult with so many people in the process, and they just rammed it through. And the two people involved, they're both good guys. But the reason why, why they created this darn certification, is because the members said that they felt like they didn't have value in their current certification. If they could call themselves performance coaches, it would increase their value. My effing God. Like, that is a reason to go out there and create a national certification based on fluff nothing. And in my mind, I've had so many issues with CSEP in the past. I know some things they do well, but they just lost me right there, full and through. And some of the people involved in bringing that together, I hope this is recorded and gets out to them, because they've lost me as well.
So help me out. You go from a CSEP up to this performance coaching.
Yes.
Grandfathered.
Yes.
It's just a free.
But what separates from anybody coming in now? Because I know the requirements to become a CEP. What are the requirements to become the new certification? Because in the last 2 years, I've been at odds with CSEP over accreditation. And that's why I want to know, because they don't define it. They're terrible to work with. You do anything on the phone or through email. Supposedly they meet twice a year. They can't make decisions. It's just awful. But so what are the requirements moving forward if I'm a young kid coming out of university, what does it require me to become a CSEP a CEP or this other certification?
Chris, I was at a conference or whatever, and they were there. Where I work now, they kind of want us to have CSEP, but not really. I mean, not enough that I actually have it. So I asked the person that was at the booth, and she literally said that they didn't know. So currently what needs to happen is if I want, for me, I don't have the CEP and I never have. I have to do the CSEP, like everyone else did. Then I can choose to do the high performance exam as well or whatever. So
there's an exam over and beyond the CEP.
Yeah, but you can't.
That's fine. That's why I didn't know.
Yeah, but what they've done is, one of the things that they said was the reason why they took out the high performance stuff was because a lot of the people that are in a performance setting that are doing the CEP don't have the clinical skills. So I asked her, if that's the case, why can't I just be certified as high performance or whatever it's called? And they were like, yeah, they're not looking at doing that at the moment because it doesn't fit the fee structure. So you have to do your CEP that's generalized, also clinical focused, and you do the specialization, and it's separate. So, but they don't know if they're going to separate it in the future, but you still have to have your CEP to do the specialization.
George, I'd love to know what they define as, when they say there's not enough people with experience in high performance, what their criteria that is.
So guys, this is awesome. And I actually think this could be a separate whole talk on certification in general. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to park that one, and let's revisit that in a whole other one, because I know we could all go down rabbit holes with that. On a related question, one of the questions I did have here is, how do you feel about the current state of education in our industry, and how do you feel about the trajectory it's going?
Well, as the educator in the bunch, let me run with this one. So current state of education, both in Canada and US, is severely limited still to this day. It has grown, it has improved. Most universities now at least have some recognition of strength conditioning as a profession and try to integrate some element of it into the curriculum. But in the assessment I did, it's been a few years ago, probably only about 40% of universities actually have curriculum that could be called leading to some kind of standard of practice for strength conditioning coaches. So even though it's improved slightly, it's there's nowhere close to the skill set needed in order to come out. As a result, which isn't a bad thing, as a result, people graduating have to put in their 3 to 5 years of internship and working for cheap in order to get the skill set they need and marry that with the theory that they've learned. So right now, the model we have, unfortunately, is just not a good model, A, for education. Nobody has any direction for where that education should go and how it should be quasi-standardized. And then B, we have a bit of a Ponzi scheme going on in our internship development, and it's a weakness of our entire industry. And this isn't just a problem with our industry, it's a problem with graduate school in general, where your role as a strength conditioning coach is to train up interns. So you train up 10 interns that go on to greater things, and then they're supposed to train up 10 interns that go on to greater things. Well, you notice that the exponential growth of that is unsustainable. So what we're doing is we're creating promises that can't be kept. Now, do they still get learning from it? Sure. Can they apply it in other areas of their life? Absolutely. But we don't have a model for education, learning, and then moving on to careers that really sustains our environment. And that's greater complicated, especially in Canada, that most faculty across Canada don't give a rat's ass about strength conditioning. Steve, you can probably speak to you bringing in the strength conditioning course at McMaster. You're lucky you had a couple faculty there that backed you up. But the faculty's domain at a university is to produce research, get grants, and attract graduate students. Well, the last thing they need is their promising students to go into a strength conditioning internship instead of coming to their program or in their lab and doing graduate work for them. And so for them to take extra time to create a course and take money out of the budget to support that course, because you need that money comes from somewhere to support that. The tuition doesn't cover everything. It's a real uphill battle. So if we're waiting for universities to create good education, it's going to be a long time.
I would say one of the biggest gaps we currently have too is not only in just undergraduate courses, but graduate courses as well in strength conditioning. I mean, even for me looking to do a master's with someone, I mean, you know, for me, a lot of the best strength coaches I've worked with had been working under Doc Smith at U of C. And obviously when that program, you know, disintegrated to a certain degree, you didn't have that opportunity anymore within the country. So just trying to find graduate degree courses or anything in terms of graduate school for strength conditioning is tough. And, you know, I have students that are looking for opportunities once they're graduating from our internship program at Brock, and we're pointing them down to Springfield College, online to Edith Cowan or St. Mary's. You know, it's tough to try and just provide them with a master's degree as a start in strength conditioning, and then certainly post that, you know, into PhD work. A lot of the students would go to, you know, New Zealand, Australia, areas like that, even in the UK or overseas. So I don't know. I think it's tough. I think we need to develop, you know, a master's-based course somewhere here in this country at an institution that's willing to take it on. But yeah, to the credit of McMaster, to have Marty Gabal and Stu Phillips both back up the introduction of the strength conditioning programming in their undergraduate curriculum, which is still going on today, being taught by Ben Barami, was a very, very you know, big step for them, and a nice boost of confidence for the strength conditioning programming that was occurring at McMaster at the time.
And Chappie is what's the name of the program they have at U of T right now? The MKIN?
Yeah, the Masters of Professional Kin is one.
It's not a research based; it's more practical based.
Yeah.
And so who runs it? Adrian?
Dave Frost is the program coordinator. Taha,
okay.
Tim Taha teaches in it. Tyson Beach teaches in it.
It strikes me they come out with a lot more practical experience than. And again, I go back, and maybe Lidstone could back me up on this. The practical experience that used to come out of George Brown College for testing and exercise prescription was, I thought, unequaled in the country. I get a sense that MKIN program's trying to copy what Calgary's doing to some degree, without necessarily the exposure to the the high performance athletes like they have out there. But just a little graphic I want to show you guys. You guys may know this. I don't know how do I share again?
Just made you a co-host there.
Oh. Yeah. This is all just, you guys have seen, I did this for the longest time. This book came out in it's grade 12 exercise science. This for years, and I mean years. I used to get grade 12 before grade 13 classes coming through. Again, George Brown used to come in every year. This for me was a big step for, I thought, Ontario anyway. But I had 20 kids in a class that probably had a misconception what exercise science was. They came in and you could really handpick, you know, the bright ones in the class that hopefully would go on and be the next level of exercise scientists that went into universities. He played football with us at U of T, Ted DeMertzoglu's, him and his wife, and they used to send me their classes to see the practical side of high performance testing, but this was a start. But we've been slow. This book's been out, geez, I don't know, 15, 20 years. Short of that, I've always taken placements from schools, but you know, how much time can you spend when you're trying to work with athletes to actually teach them, have some kind of practical component of it where they're actually programming and supervising conditioning programs? It's in the private sector, just you got to make a buck. You just don't have the time. So you kind of just hope that the universities will come on board, and it seems like the Calgary model seemed to be working until I think Doc Smith stepped down. They were going through some growth, but U of T seems to be picking up the ball. If anybody's got some more insight to that program, I'd like to hear it. I just know a couple people that came out of it.
What's interesting too, Chris, is like Ted, the author of that text, is now a big proponent for physical literacy and speaks annually at the physical literacy conferences that are going on around the country. So
he's walked away from teaching, or is he still?
No, he's still teaching. Still teaching, but he just speaks at the physical literacy conferences, especially trying to bring back where physical literacy was probably a decade ago, prior to a lot of restrictions being placed on what they could do in physical education with kids. No inversion, no backwards traveling, things like that. He's trying to undo all that.
Oh, neat.
So Chris, I taught in the undergrad practicum at U of T, and it's modeled very similar. I don't really want to open that can of worms right now. So I'd say maybe we tag that on to education and certification in a combo talk down the road. Because that's to kind of explain what they're trying to do. It is pretty cool, and it is worth spending some time on. Ian, you got anything to add on this? We also didn't get to your struggle if you had one.
Yeah, the struggle is part of the giving away so much time, so much energy, and leaving other opportunities. But I think it's worth it, because there's so much give back in this industry, and the amount of people you meet and contacts you get in touch with, and the athletes, and and as you see them as you get older, you see them now in different roles, some of them fathers and mothers, and they're bringing up their kids. It's it's just amazing. I think that enough kind of takes the place of any of the accolades or any of the money, the time, the effort. But it's a tough haul, because we're not looked at as if we know anything, and everybody and his grandmother's a coach. Go on YouTube and, hey, let's try this, let's do that, and your worth is not seen where it should be based on what you've done in your life and your body of work and all that. So basically, but Ted was the reason why we sent our boys to Birchmount, because he was there for a year. Recruiters over there went down there for a year, and then he started the work on a textbook. But great guy, man, and every once in a while we get together and talk and stuff. But yeah, great guy, great kids, everything else. So it's funny how small this circle is.
Yeah,
it's crazy. It's crazy.
And that's part of the goal of this, is to get these names out that that have influenced all you guys. You know, Ted's another one I've read that completely forgot about till you brought that up, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So we've only gotten through less than half of my questions, guys. We might have to do a part 3 here. But let's keep on this one. What do you think right now is the biggest problem in our industry? And what are you scared about the trajectory that it's on?
Can I go back at that one? I think starting with whether it's my age or what, I don't know, but social media aspect, because people are seeing things, and a lot of people are building their clientele based on me thinking of this ridiculous exercise that nobody's ever done, putting it out there, and people are like, oh, I got to get some of that. I used to coach younger kids at a point in time when I first started. It's hard coaching younger kids now when you're in the same environment with older individuals and they're doing things that take the attention away and they're looking over there, you're trying to keep their attention. But I think there's so much emphasis on that and people building their business. And now the individuals that have built their business on the social media side, they're kind of hurting because they don't have a facility to do all that stuff in. So now they're realizing, okay, we got to go back to basics, just basic exercises. And how can I get this individual to really still keep his shape without all that equipment, all the toys, nothing else but using your mind to put something together for them. So it's depending how long we stay out. Like I think Sam, you put in Peloton. Those guys are brilliant. They're losing money like crazy, but you can get their app for $12.95. So if you're general pop, how are you going to compete with that? Like I personally don't think, I'd like to hear everybody else. I personally don't think the arena we coach in, we can actually do that. Maybe by VR when it comes up, I don't know. So I'm trying to think what is going to take place after this, after we get out. Not quite sure. But I think that's been a little dangerous, and I don't know. Might be my age.
If I could go on, the biggest risk we face is none of us have a clue how to run business or work in a business environment. We're moving more and more, the trend is into these directors of human performance roles or more leadership roles, and that's a great thing. Finally, people are starting to recognize strength conditioning coaches as having that all-around expertise to be able to manage a sports performance team. But I would challenge, I'd love to see some of the resumes of some of the people on here. They're probably garbage. Your ability to run a meeting, some of you is probably garbage. Your ability to manage a budget spreadsheet is probably garbage. The ability to create a strategic plan, you have no freaking clue where to start. You know, we just haven't been brought up as managers. And so many times at so many different levels, I hear of these strength conditioning nightmares where some of my students go, or some of my colleagues, some of the people that are on this list have gone, and it's turned into a nightmare because the people involved cannot manage. They have no idea how to manage people, how to run a company. And that's going to be a kiss of death if we move into these larger roles and we can't perform and perform well. We have such a great skill set. We have such abilities in so many areas to recognize what is needed for the athletes. If we can't convey that in a business sense, we're going to run ourselves backwards again.
Trevor?
Yeah.
Do you know any program out there from a kinesiology standpoint, health fitness, that have a business course?
Yeah, I know business courses, but I don't think any of them are particularly
in the curriculum of a phys ed program? No?
Yeah, so I have two at Sheridan. We have two. We have organizational leadership development and business administration. Business administration is how do you create your own starter business and work in a business context. If you look at the content, I think the content is good. It's on the right track, but it's still not catered to our profession enough and the challenges we'll face. It's a good starter. The leadership and organization, same comment. I think it's a very general course. I don't think it's quite as detailed as this is how you do this. You know, this is how you run a meeting. This is how you establish a budget. This is how you create a strategic plan. You know, that's that kind of stuff. I've just picked up on the fly over the years, but when I was in Texas working in this corporation with a $5.5 billion a year budget and 26,000 employees, all of a sudden I started to see, oh, all right, that's how these things run. organizational culture that goes with it. So coming back to here, I'm looking around going, wow, no one's ever sat us down and had some conversations about how to manage a group.
Chris, thoughts on that? Thoughts on the direction and what you see the biggest issue?
Well, I've seen the funding model change drastically over 40 odd years. I remember the days when an athlete was making $300 karting a month, and then it got bumped up to 600, and they thought they'd hit the Ontario. And just the evolution of it's bone of contention, but the evolution of say the OTP model, about, you can call it what you will. Some people want to call it cherry picking, is that they're trying to target the money towards obviously success. I understand it. I've always loved the battle more so than the outcome. That somebody, like, who saw Adam Vancouverton coming along? Who saw, for me, a bunch of different athletes come along and just win the world over? You never know where the next superstar is going to be, but it's the funding models for me is changed drastically, whether it's good or bad. For the Joe Schmo out there like me, a private enterprise, trying to run a lab, it's different, definitely. Used to do a lot of contracts for the various sports systems, the NSOs and PSOs, a lot of work. That's changed. It's changed for me, two reasons. Probably because I left the Fitness Institute. That was my my backyard, but it's been different. It's a different world out there from a standpoint of high performance sport.
Sheldon, Steve, thoughts on that one?
Well, again, it comes back to something that I alluded to. I mean, I learned how to manage a budget because, I mean, I wasn't thrown into the deep end. I was put in the deep end, and somebody held my foot down underwater, and it was a trial by fire and learning. But it was huge in terms of teaching me how. So, I mean, how many of the coaches on this call have said, okay, I want to make X. What do I need in order to achieve X? And what's that going to cost me? And actually do budgets throughout the course of the year, self budgets. So, I mean, I agree with Trevor, just in terms of the understanding of the business side needs to be a huge component of what we're doing. And we are not really necessarily instructed in that way.
I would add too, there's a great book that was discussed. I wouldn't say great book, but a good book by Ron McCaffrey on CEO Strength Coach. It was given to me by a friend of mine. And just when I was entering into these roles, is in my role currently as associate director, where I'm in charge of budgets and staffing, and going to upper management meetings with VPs of the university, and just sitting around and seeing how one of these meetings is conducted, as far as minutes, as far as just a variety of things that I hadn't been a part of in past. Other than actually Trevor having me sit on a board for Sheridan College for a period of time, that was my first introduction to how to actually host a proper meeting and things like that. So, yeah, finding mentors in the area, I think, are a good thing that a lot of people have brought up. And I think that's something that's concerning to me, is just that lack of development in our current transition coaches to actually build budgets and be able to manage their entire portfolio of what's required from a budgetary standpoint of purchasing, staffing, all those things I had to learn. For me, I remember my athletic director at McMaster was a CFO. Jeff Giles was his name. And when he came on board, he was adamant that we all be better at what we're doing budgetary wise. And so although we didn't see eye to eye at times, at the same time, he actually did, I'm grateful for the trials that I went through with him, because I got a chance to really develop, my understanding of budgeting and just staffing and everything that goes along with just managing an entire staff and organization. So I think sometimes it is trial by fire. I agree with Sheldon, but and necessary trials, because I think, but I think there can be a better development for our coaches moving forward as far as a business acumen.
And it sounds like we put all this together and we're solving the world, team. It's all the knowledge at once. That's 2:30. That was an hour and a half, guys. If everyone is open to it, I would like to continue one more next week. Our new guest didn't arrive today, so I'm going to try really hard to get him to start next week. And if you can make it back, I have a still long list. And if we finish that list, we can start diving into the cert education stuff. But guys, thank you. This is amazing. And I think I speak for everyone in saying that we could do this all day, every day, and not actually do any work and enjoy it. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
Thanks,
just
Chris.
thank Chaps as well for agreeing to mediate this amazing opportunity. I just had a great time sitting back and listen. And again, if you guys are interested, I know your time is very valuable, but it looks like this is what the people want. So
That went fast, very fast.
More rants, man. Need more rants.
Yeah,
Foley didn't yell at all this meeting. I'm just going by that.
Trev, you didn't answer my question though. Is there anybody that doesn't piss you off?
You know what?